All right.
Okay.
All right, we're ready.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm glad we've got everything working. That's quite a relief, definitely. This is the latest event in this year's Science Literacy Week, which is a series of events held across Canada in various academic libraries and I believe lots of other kinds of institutions as well. I'm joined by Andrea, who is one of the organising team for this week's set of events. I'd quickly, before we get into your wonderful presentation, I'd like to quickly shamelessly plug some other events that are happening this week. So tomorrow morning, we have a tour of Montreal heat islands and interesting information about heat islands in Montreal, about heat reflection and so on. On Thursday, we have the ever-popular Joe Schwartz, who is well known as a science popularizer and also a debunker of pseudoscientific nonsense. I'm a big fan of that, and he'll be on Thursday afternoon. And on Friday, we have a presentation and a workshop on how to use LaTeX and Overleaf, including McGill's advanced access to LaTeX and Overleaf. So that's just three things that I picked. There are many other things happening as well. And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Christie Rowe. I've recently, in the last few months, become the liaison librarian for, amongst other subjects, earth and planetary sciences. I've been getting to know people in my liaison areas. It's been a great pleasure to get to know Christie and others, or to start to. Christie has been an associate professor here, I believe, since 2017. I believe that's correct. That's what your CV says, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're an affiliated researcher at the University of Cape Town, I saw, which is interesting.
That's right. Yeah.
Kind of more about that sometime.
Yeah.
And a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Earth and Planetary Sciences.
Also correct.
So all wonderful stuff. And I'm embarrassing you, I'm sorry.
No.
And I picked out that you received the 2017 Principals Prize for Outstanding Emerging Researcher. So
I did.
So this would be very, very exciting. And most excitingly for librarians is the collaboration between Christie and the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department and the library on the completely gold platinum open access journal called Seismica, which aims to make science more open, more accessible, more available to the public outside of expensive academic libraries. And we think that's absolutely fantastic. So we're very, very happy to be involved in that. I'll stop talking and I'll let you get on with it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Martin. Oh, stop it. Oh, stop. We don't applaud in here. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I'm excited about Science Literacy Week. I have not previously participated, and I love to have this coming through the libraries because I think it's science in general, we're underutilizing the librarians. They have an incredible wealth of skills, many of which map perfectly onto what we lack as scientists. So my engagement with the library has been super rewarding and productive. So I really appreciate being part of this event. This is a general talk about what I think every Montrealer should know about earthquakes. And Aube Gordeau contributed quite a bit to this talk. She's a collaborator in my research group. She's not here today because she's actually teaching at Sept now and incorporating some of this stuff into the curriculum that she's teaching in her science. So the key points, this is, if anyone's trying to leave early, you can do that because I'm telling you the key points. Key points are earthquakes happen in Quebec. They're pretty frequent. The earthquakes we have here are not as large as the earthquakes that we get at tectonic plate boundaries, but our risk here, the risk of damage due to earthquakes is very high due to infrastructure factors. And you, as a resident of Montreal, should have short-term and medium-term plans related to seismic safety in your home, in your place of work, in your school. And the graphic here is just like a little news, it's like a CTV news graphic for when they were reporting on the October 10th, 2012 magnitude 4.5 earthquake. Did anyone remember feeling that?
I do.
We got a good jolt on that one here in the city. Some of you weren't here yet, but so in this talk, I'm going to cover a few basic areas. First of all, what are earthquakes? How do earthquakes cause damage? Why we have earthquakes here in Montreal, and what you can do to be ready. And this is going to be informal since there's not too many people in the room. So if you would like to shout out any questions or ask me to pause if I've accidentally slipped in some jargon, I would appreciate that. And we can make it more of a conversation. Yeah, and here's everyone's hometown hero, Dwayne Johnson, saving California from the San Andreas fault. Earthquakes, I think because they're very mysterious and mostly happen underground, have taken on all kinds of forms in media and in entertainment. And so I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what they are and the effects that they cause, and especially how they relate to other types of natural hazards. So basically, what you need to know about earthquakes is that the planet that we live on is not alive, but it's moving all the time. It's a dynamic, although it's solid, it's dynamic. And so there are small movements of the crust of the earth going on all the time, and that contribute to earthquakes. So if you think about that on a global scale, how vast the surface of the earth is, and thinking about the tens of kilometers depth over which earthquakes occur beneath the surface, it becomes intuitively apparent why it's very difficult to predict earthquakes, because they're part of a huge global and complicated system. Normally we don't feel anything, even though those movements are going on underneath our feet. The earthquakes are just the little skips and jumps that occur during those movements. And faults are the cracks, usually between tectonic plates, where most of that movement occurs. Faults are like old scars, old breaks. Some of them are active areas of deformation in the Earth's crust, and some of them are very old and ancient and haven't moved in billions of years, but they never fully heal, so they always have the potential to produce earthquakes in the future. So what does that look like? Here's a graphic showing what some key elements of an earthquake. So here's the Earth's crust. Here's some construction built on top of it. And this is kind of a little cartoon of what a fault might look like. So this is a break between the rocks that are under our feet. And these things can extend down. Earthquakes happen as shallow as 2 or 3 kilometers deep. And they go down all the way through the crust.
So it's not necessarily just going side to side, they can slip and go like that as well?
That's right, they can slip in any direction,
okay.
Side, side, up, down. In volcanoes, sometimes they actually do this.
Okay.
So the point on the fault that starts the slipping is called the hypocenter, and the point directly above it on the Earth's surface is called the epicenter. So when you see an earthquake on a map, you're looking at the epicenter. The hypocenter is just below it. And as that slip occurs, the slip on that crack will propagate out from the hypocenter, and it can get bigger and bigger. So small earthquakes slip small sections of the fault, and the more of the fault that's activated in that slip, the bigger the earthquake will be. And so also in this cartoon, we see the effects of not of the earthquake, but of the failure of the infrastructure. So very close to the hypocenter or very close to the epicenter, you tend to see more intense shaking. And so we see more damage. And as you get farther away, you might see reduced amount of damage, assuming all these houses were the same. But there are certain site conditions that can also accentuate damage. And this is represented here by maybe this is a structure that was built on artificial filled land, which we often do in areas like a wetland, fill in the land and build structures on it, and that is not firm ground, that is squishy ground, and so it amplifies the shaking from earthquakes.
What do volcanoes have to do with earthquakes?
So an earthquake is any time a rock is cracking and it makes basically a sound. It's the sound of the earthquake that is what we feel. And in volcanoes, there are lots of shifts and breaks due to magma moving through the crust and gases escaping and coming through the volcano. So volcano seismology is a whole field of research of observing the earthquakes that happen within volcanoes to try to understand how magma is moving and contributing to eruptions, predicting eruptions. Yeah, cool, right? Yeah. Okay, so these kind of cracks, this is like a little one that's like near a village, but there's this network of cracks that spans the entire globe, and these are the most major ones of them that separate the tectonic plates. So this plate boundary here is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. It started to develop when all the continents were together, so maybe like 300 million years ago. They started to spread apart, and we separated from these other continents about 180 or 200 million years ago. And so the mid-ocean ridge is having little earthquakes all the time as it's making new crust and expanding the Atlantic Ocean. And on the Pacific side, as the Atlantic grows, the Pacific Ocean is closing. And so on the Pacific side, the plates of the ocean are going underneath the continental plates, and that causes another kind of plate boundary, which is actually famous for the biggest earthquakes in the world and volcanoes. So those are called subduction zones. And so when we think about earthquakes, we think about California and the San Andreas Fault. We think about Japan with all these plates coming together. New Zealand has been in the news a lot for earthquakes in the last few years. And we have our own like major epic world-class subduction zone here in Canada, where this little tiny plate, which is left over part of what used to be a much bigger ocean plate, is disappearing under the North American continental margin. So this is called the Cascadia subduction zone, and the US just funded a whole big new research center to focus just on Cascadia, and so there's a lot of room for collaboration now between, because this is the coast of BC and then the states of Washington, Oregon, and California in the US. So we can expect to see a lot of new research coming out of that area.
How quickly is that plate disappearing?
What's the convergence rate in Cascadia?
45 millimeters per year.
45 millimeters per year.
That much?
Today.
Yeah,
Wow.
she's not a ringer either. So
I
you
just
might,
give a lecture about Cascadia.
yeah, perfect. I don't know
In my
my
class.
too many plate rates off the top of my head. So you might notice that we are not positioned anywhere near a tectonic plate boundary. We're smack in the middle of the North American plate. We're on a passive margin here, meaning that we transit like from continent to ocean without going across any shifting boundaries. And so you might think like, why would we have earthquakes at a setting like this? So first I'm going to tell you a little bit about like plate boundary earthquakes, which are what better understood, and then I'll come back to what makes our setting different and why it's harder actually to predict earthquakes here. Okay, so this is a little video showing basically what an earthquake looks like. So these, imagine you're in an orchard and there's a road going through it. These are just markers because what we have here is a fault zone between two plates, and in the long term, these plates are moving in these two directions. So on the right, they're going north, and on the left, they're going south. And the plates are moving like this, but the fault zone itself is locked for some period of time. So that looks like this. The plates bend, and then one moment, boom, they break. So all of that energy is stored up by the bending of those plates, by the very slow distortion from the plate motion, and then it's released in an instant. And that's the moment where the tectonic timescales of the Earth interface with the human timescales of messing up our infrastructure. And so the Earth, on the long term, it's just a creaking while it's constantly moving. But for us, those little creaks are really catastrophic and damaging. So I wanted to highlight Turkey because of the two really massive earthquakes that happened last February, and to show you how complicated the plate boundary situation can be. So this is the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey, Greece, Macedonia. Is this Macedonia?
Macedonia is the little one.
The little one. Yeah, right, Bulgaria.
Yeah.
So in the Eastern Mediterranean, there are a lot of small tectonic plates that are shifting around, and they're actually moving quite quickly. So this is the Anatolian Fault. It goes right to Istanbul, which is here. And it's moving on average 2.5 centimeters per year. And then this is actually the branch of the fault that broke during the February's earthquakes. And this is a considerably slower fault on the long term, but it's still going through those same creaks and breaks. But you can see if you were going to predict, with all this motion going on here, which fault is the most hazardous, which one is likely to break the soonest, just from looking at the plate motions alone, you can't necessarily make specific predictions. But we do have a few ways of thinking about this that are useful. So these years show the last date of a large damaging earthquake on different segments of the Anatolian Fault. So 1939, 1942, 43, 51, 1944, 57, 67, 64, 53. And so this is from a 2013 paper, but I think this is actually noted before that. Here's the 1999 earthquakes, and the prediction now is that we have what we call a seismic gap. So if this whole fault is going to eventually catch up with an average rate of 2.5 centimeters per year, all the different segments of the fault will eventually catch up with that rate. The missing one, at least for the last 100 years, is right through Istanbul. So although we can't predict when that's going to happen, we have some reasonable expectation that there's a high risk for a large earthquake here in Istanbul. Okay.
Excuse me.
Okay, I couldn't help but throw in this video. So if you remember the fault map, this is actually this fault down here, showing the 2013 earthquakes. And this is a little animation that was put together by Diego Melgar from University of Oregon and collaborators in Turkey. And this shows what happens when the earthquake breaks through. So there are no geographic reference frame on this, unless you can read that long off the top of your head. But this is the arcuate fault that generated the first earthquake. And if you remember, there was a second earthquake that basically happened at nearly like the same day. It was less than 24 hours later. And so Melgar and others looked at the seismic signals that came from the earthquake, looked at the ground deformation, and then created this model to show the speed of rupture on the fault. And this is showing the energy with time. So the red one is the first earthquake, and it shows how the fault broke in one place, and then this spice actually stops slipping at the initial place, and the earthquake propagates along the fault to reach other areas. And so overall, this is hundreds of kilometers long. And this is the final, like how much slip happened in each place, or how much energy was released at each place, which is also difficult to predict, but it has to do with the shape of the faults and the energy available when the earthquake is propagating through. Okay, so what does that look like on the surface? This is the gnarly fault, which is actually one on this smaller rupture. And oops, didn't mean to put it again. So this is an example of one of those breaks. This is just a road going through some agricultural fields. And when that earthquake came to the surface, it displaced that road by about 2 meters or so. And that probably took like about a second to do. So if you'd been on that road, you would have felt violent shaking, and you would have seen a jerk like this that lasted about a second of that movement. And it's very sharp where it comes to the surface, a very thin crack. Here are the researchers standing on what we would call the offset marker. So if we use the edge of the road as a marker, then we can see exactly how far the displacement is by measuring the difference between those. Okay, so how do these earthquakes cause damage? What I just showed you is direct displacement. So that's like taking the Earth's surface and actually deforming it on the spot when the slip occurs. So this affects structures, roads, pipelines that are actually co-located with the fault. The fault physically crosses them. So this kind of damage really only happens at the line where the earthquake reaches the surface. But what's more damaging over greater areas is the effects of shaking. It can go really far from the fault, as we previously saw, it's not always decaying regularly with distance from the fault. It's really sensitive to site-specific characteristics. And the shaking can cause triggered hazards, and those triggered hazards include things like landslides, tsunamis, liquefaction, and also more earthquakes. But I want to emphasize, if you walk out of here with nothing else, the severity of structural damage depends on the style, age, and quality of construction and the local soil and bedrock conditions. So this is a pretty famous photo from Taiwan in the 1999 Chi earthquake. This particular fault broke like this, with the rock coming up and thrusting over like that. And so this is an example of direct displacement, where it took what was previously a horizontal running track and offset probably more than 2 meters in vertical and a little bit in horizontal as well. These are some examples of shaking damage. So this is from the 1994 earthquake, the Northridge earthquake in Los Angeles, which happened early in the morning and famously collapsed a whole bunch of freeways. But that earthquake didn't actually break the ground. That was a blind earthquake, meaning that the earthquake slip came up, maybe bent the ground a little bit, but didn't cut through like the fields in Turkey. And so all of this was shaking damage. And then we can see the effect of the tight and maintenance level of the construction in Turkey. This is typical shaking damage that occurred when walls that were poorly anchored just like fell off the buildings, even if the buildings themselves were still standing. Okay, liquefaction affects areas usually where the sediment is saturated. So this is from Christchurch in New Zealand, and what happens is if you have wet sand or mud that's maybe a few meters below the ground, so not necessarily puddles on surface, but a place where if, for example, you're in the spring and there's lots of water running under the ground through the city, that sediment with the water in it, when it gets shaken up, basically can turn to a slurry with no strength at all.
It's like a non-Newtonian kind of thing.
Exactly, yeah. If you're lucky enough, they're at the right place, it could be very non-Newtonian. And so that means that it can't support any weight at all. So this is from California in 1989, and these are buildings where the lower story sunk into the ground or was rotated, and so the upper stories came crashing down to the ground. And this is obviously the effect of shaking sand with cars parked on top of it. They just collapsed into the mud.
Is that because it's an island?
No, I don't know where this particular site was, but it's common on coastlines. Like the problem in San Francisco is that they had filled in parts of San Francisco Bay and not adequately compacted or drained it. And so there's like large areas of that area of San Francisco area that are susceptible to this. And I don't know actually the case here, but anywhere where people are building on lake beds or old wetlands, or places where the water table is very high seasonally, usually spring. This is two kind of horrific examples. This is, of course, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake under Honshu that created a really devastating tsunami in Japan. That was triggered directly by that rupture of the earthquake reaching the seafloor and displacing the water column in the ocean to create that wave that then made its way on shore. This is a triggered landslide. They happen in areas that are already susceptible to landslides, as you might imagine. And they're also very sensitive to the water content of the soil, but they can be quite devastating, particularly because they come on the back of the shaking damage that occurs during an earthquake. And yeah. Oh, yeah. And then I wanted to talk about triggered earthquakes a little bit. Earthquakes do make other earthquakes more likely to occur because of the shaking and because they change the stress in the crust. And so this is an example. I showed the collapsed freeway from the 1994 Northridge earthquake. That earthquake didn't reach the surface. In 1971, there was the San Fernando. There was the San Fernando Valley earthquake in 1971. That one did reach the surface. And so the balance of stresses from the Sept 1970s earthquake shifted under this basin in Los Angeles and made this earthquake more likely, probably accelerated this earthquake happening. The 71 earthquake, by the way, had a huge effect on earthquake safety legislation in California, which echoed around the world. This is where they started to make laws that if you knew where a fault line was, you could not build a school or a hospital directly on top of it. So in California, there's a mandatory setback and an investigation zone when you're doing construction. And that's, in order to use those laws to make people safer, we need to know where the fault lines are. So I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. Yeah.
So you talked about like the hypocenter and the epicenter.
Yeah.
If the movement is like not like up and down, does that mean the epicenter is like not directly above?
Yes. So what's that picture? Yep. So in this case, that's actually true. So the epicenter isn't where the fault meets the surface. It's just where it's directly above the hypocenter. Yeah.
Sorry.
So this part we can see, and after an earthquake, there are a lot of people in the research community will go out directly, get a drone, they have flyovers with a satellite, they'll get satellite imagery, they'll find the ground deformation. This place, it comes from the seismologists, the people who have instruments everywhere and they're looking for the wiggly lines. And so by triangulating from multiple locations, they get a pretty good idea of where the earthquake started, where the first waves came from. And so they'll tell us where that projects to the surface.
And it won't necessarily be the place where there's the worst damage,
Right.
assuming everything is equal, right?
So when we then go to like look at regulation and look at calculate the hazards, what the engineers want to do those calculations is to know the epicenter and the depth of a likely earthquake, and then they can create an artificial shaking map from that, and then they want to know what are the ground characteristics, and then they want to know what type of buildings did you build there, and then eventually you come out with something that looks like a seismic risk map. Yeah.
Are you going to talk about areas around Montreal?
I will show some Montreal maps at the end. Yeah. I don't want to scare anybody, and I don't do individual property consultations. Yeah. Okay, so 3 things everyone wants to know about earthquakes. Are they predictable? No, they are not.
Really?
Yes. They are forecastable.
Yeah.
Yeah. 2, because earthquakes are part of the long-term movement, we can forecast where they're more likely and where they're more frequent and where they are bigger on a regional scale. And then, but there's been this huge advancement in the last 10 or 20 years of earthquake early warning systems, which I'll talk about at the end, and which will be rolling out here in Canada, including eventually all the way to us, Montreal. So this is a map of known earthquakes in Canada for the last several hundred years.
Really?
Yeah. We have one magnitude 9 that occurred on January 20th, 1700, January 20th. And we know that because we know the exact time that the tsunami this earthquake made arrived in Japan. So we know exactly when that happened. There's also a lot of really large earthquakes that have happened here along the Pacific coast, and this is places where that little Juan de Fuca Pacific plate is going down underneath the margin, and then where it shares a boundary with the Pacific plate here. We have the Mackenzie Mountains and these areas in the northwest where the collision of plates is causing interior fracturing and mountain building inside of the continent there. And then we have these big blobs over here, far away from any plate boundary, nowhere that you would expect to see seismic activity. And the biggest one here is the Charleroi earthquake of 1663.
Charleroi.
Yeah.
Really?
So the best way to know where an earthquake's likely to occur or the first order way, is to look at where earthquakes have previously occurred. So you won't be surprised to see the seismic hazard map of Canada looks nearly identical to the past earthquake map of Canada. So these are areas that are likely to experience extreme ground shaking. I don't actually know anything about zones of hazard up here or in the far north, but if we zoom in a little bit on the Montreal area, this is, okay. So I cut off exactly what time period this is. I think this might be all large known earthquakes, so the depths are just estimated. Yeah, so here we are in the Western Quebec, what's known as the Western Quebec seismic zone, which incorporates Montreal out to Ottawa, upstate New York, and then spreads up into the continent, into the interior toward the Abitibi. And we have one large earthquake that occurred in Temiskaming in 1935 here. So we have like a very distributed area, not focused on a single fault line. And this shows the areas, the places on the surface where we see breaks in the rock coming to the surface, some of which are ancient fault lines that have no obvious evidence of recent activity, but because they exist, because they're cracks in the crust, it is not impossible that they could also be activated again. And some of these maybe have a possibility of being responsible for some of these earthquakes, but like the Northridge 1994, because these earthquakes are not super big and because they start at 15 or 20 kilometers depth, they don't reach all the way to the surface. So it's very rare for one of those earthquakes to actually show itself and do direct damage, but to let us know exactly where the fault is. So we're dependent on the seismological evidence from the seismic network to show us where those earthquakes occur. Okay, so these are the greatest earthquakes kind of in the recent times. The Charlevoix earthquake, obviously during 1600s and 1700s, there were no seismometers here. So the estimate of the size of the earthquake is based on the records of eyewitness accounts of the type of damage that went on. The structural response mostly, did all the chimneys fall down? Did the walls fall down? Did trees fall down? Did trees break? This kind of thing. Did it cause like tsunamis in the St. Lawrence? Temiskaming, I think not instrumentally recorded, but scientifically observed. And then this is the biggest one in recent times, 5.4 in Cornwall. Although we had there was magnitude 3 and a bit down there.
How far is Cornwall?
Is Cornwall?
From us?
It's down here somewhere.
100
100
And
kilometers.
when you see in the mountains, or if you ever hike, and you see huge rocks cracked,
Yeah.
is that an example?
So if it's probably not. Like most of the landforms we have around here are due to the glaciations. So those big boulders, if you see a big boulder sitting out on a mountaintop or in the Laurentians, it was carried there by ice. And then when the ice melts and the support melts around it, oftentimes they crack open. But I think most of the time when you see a crack, it's like an opening mode like this. If you see an earthquake, it'll be a slip. It'll displace the halves. So if you see an open crack, but it looks like it could be closed again, it's probably not earthquake related. So this is what the ground underneath our feet looks like. So the Laurentians are made of this pink rock, and they stand up here. And down, once you come down out of Laurentians, you come to this flatlands, come across Laval and Montreal, and all the way across the South Shore, very flat. We're sitting on top of all of these sediments that were deposited in oceans hundreds of millions of years ago, and more recently by the Champlain Sea that covered this area after the glaciers receded. So this is their structure, a very old, 100 millions of years old structure. The Laurentian granite is very strong, but it's cut by lots of faults that are hundreds of millions of years old that were buried by more sediments that were cut by more faults. So we have this like really complicated history. I think of it as like a stained glass window where all the pieces have been stuck together. But if you were to drop that window, like it would still break on the same lines. Like there's still the persistent weaknesses that will last forever. So here's what that looks like in cross section. So here we are, maybe looking from Quebec City out the St. Lawrence. And the Charlevoix area with its beautiful like ring of mountains and the bays was formed by a meteorite impact 320 odd million years ago, smashing into the St. Lawrence Seaway. And so it created all these ring faults that look like this, and that go down quite deep. And so Charlevoix still has more earthquakes than any other area around here, and it's because it has all these old cracks that have never healed up properly, and they are still very active. And Yajin's group has been monitoring them. She has seismometers up there. What's the biggest one that you guys have measured in the last few years?
Magnitude 3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So people feel that.
That's typical, like 1 to 3 at the typical range of magnitudes there.
Yeah. So all this old history goes into contributing to the modern environment. Okay, so, but like lots of places on Earth have these cracks that are old and they're still there, but they don't all have a concentration of earthquakes like we do in the Western Quebec seismic zone. So there's a few other things that contribute to earthquakes here, adding to the effects of having those old cracks. So one of them is that hundreds of millions of years ago, a lot of volcanoes developed. We know them here as the Montrealer Hills, which we're sitting right on top of, but they have buddies in Ontario with these kimberlites, down in the White Mountains in New Hampshire, and then offshore and all the way out into the Atlantic plate on the New England seamass. So the exact reasons why these volcanoes developed are still debated, but the recent work from a transportable array of geophysical instruments that went through this area definitely showed that they left a scar in the structure of the North American plate. So there's a thinness and a weakness here that corresponds to the action of that volcanic event. And so that may be a big contributor to our concentration of seismicity here in this region. And then the other thing, which is not local to us, but is affecting all of northern North America, is the fact that our plate is still rising from the depression that it went through when it was covered with ice. So there was 2.5 kilometers of ice above where we're standing, not very long ago, like most recently, maybe like 12 to 15,000 years ago. And so that pushed the continent down, and now it's bouncing back. And as it bounces back, it flexes, and so there's a ridge of bending that passes north as that flexure relaxes. And so in the last several thousand years, that bend of flexure has passed through this area. So that causes stress. That's like the perfect condition for reactivating these old fractures and faults. And the uplift rate is still quite high, and this is contributing to, actually the biggest earthquake in recent times was in Gava, where the uplift rate is still really high.
So this will flex across the continent at some point.
Yeah, so it's flexing up, and it varies because of the age of recession of the ice.
Mm-hmm.
So the uplift rate here, this is actually subsiding probably because of groundwater loss, but so we've come through the flexure probably in the last couple thousand years,
Mm-hmm.
but it's still having an effect.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay.
And a meteor hitting us somewhere
Yeah.
will trigger.
Meteors are a great earthquake source. Kind of perfect, yeah.
Because wasn't there one just recently going by the Earth?
Yeah, they come by a lot. And most of them break up in the atmosphere, but every once in a while they hit. I can't think of one that was in recorded times that was big enough to create earthquakes.
I don't remember either.
Yeah, we've been very lucky. But
Yeah.
Quebec is incredibly old. So if you look on Google Earth and you look at the ground surface, you can see many very large impact features. But it's because the surface is so old, it's like looking at the moon. Like those things have accumulated over hundreds of millions of years, even billions of years.
When we drive through the Adirondacks, I'm always taking pictures of cracked rock, and that's cracked in squares.
Yes, some rocks really like to crack in squares. A lot of that has to do with the expansion of the rock. So freeze thaw is a big contributor. Water goes into the cracks and then opens them when the ice forms, and then they open progressively because of that. But also rocks that have been buried, when they come to the surface, the stress on them is relaxed and they expand. And so that's a big contributor to making these fractures as well.
Huh.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's interesting because similar rocks it depends on how icy the climate is, whether you get really blocky or you get nice rounded things like in
Saskatchewan
Yeah.
has rounded rocks.
Yes.
Geodes or something?
Oh yeah. Oh, those are probably concretions. That's a whole nother deal. I could give a talk on that next week if you want. Yeah. Okay, so I put this slide up here to remind me of a particular tragedy that occurred in Italy. You might remember the L'Aquila earthquake of 2009. It was like a really beautiful, very, very old village that was affected directly. Like the earthquake occurred. That village was basically the epicenter of the earthquake. And there were 4 shocks leading up to the earthquake. So there were felt earthquakes in the days and weeks beforehand. And the geophysical observatories told people not to worry because clusters of small earthquakes do happen very frequently. But this particular cluster was then followed by a really devastating earthquake. And the geophysicists and some of the government officials were put on trial for failing to warn people and basically being responsible for their deaths and the destruction. And this really brought the conversation about earthquake prediction and forecasting into the public eye because there was enough belief among the society that the geophysicists could have predicted it and decided not to save lives, that they actually were convicted, and I think their conviction was eventually overturned. I wanted to clarify a little bit about earthquake prediction. So we're recording thousands of earthquakes around the globe all the time, and there's always going to be little bumps and spikes and things in those earthquakes. So there's an entire science of statistical seismology, of looking at the patterns of earthquakes in time and space and trying to project those patterns into the future. And part of forecasting does rely on that. But it's like watching the stock market. Like you get a hunch or something, or you can look at patterns and say, well, I know that this industry is going to tank because this other thing happened. But oftentimes those guesses are wrong, and even the best, like most successful people make mistakes or can't see the future because it's not always a pattern and things don't follow a pattern. And so that's a very simple, relatively like man-made system, the stock markets. There's relatively less chaos in that system than looking at the Earth system for L'Aquila. Another popular avenue that gets pushed on social media and conspiracy theories is that conjunctions of the planets are responsible for spikes in earthquakes activity. So I wanted to pitch seismic a little bit again and just throw up this report that we published earlier this year. And could planets and conjunctions be used to predict large earthquakes? And the abstract says no. And so this is actually an homage to a paper that was 10 or 15 years before that was debunking another prediction it became very popular online. There's like a Dutch guy who I think is an engineer or something that's always predicting earthquakes according to the stars, and it's no. Here's a government-funded earthquake prediction experiment that was like probably the best structured one to happen recently. So Parkfield, California is a little town on the San Andreas Fault that was having earthquakes at 20-year intervals, like very regularly, 1857, 1881, 1901, 1922, 1934, 1966. So like really nice pace, and you think, okay, if there's anything that happens right before an earthquake, if there's an indicator that we can pick up, if it's a special kind of foreshock sequence, or if it's a change in ground movement or temperature, if it's groundwater moving in a particular way, new springs coming up or old springs turning off or something, this would be a place where we know we're going to have an earthquake. So let's put out all the monitoring instruments. We'll get all our teams out there. If there's anything to see, we'll detect it. And so they did instrument everything. There was a 1984, I think, earthquake after this flood. And then there was supposed to be another one in 2004, and they waited for it. And then I think in 2005, there was one on a neighboring fault, like a few kilometers away. Just popped off in the wrong place, not where the instruments were. So the outcome from that was that they did not find what we call precursor phenomena, or any kind of Earth behavior that immediately precedes an earthquake. No discoveries were made. So subsequently, there's been this other project, which is called the San Andreas Fault Observatory at Depth, where they drilled down into this is on the Pacific plate, and then down into the fault at a place where the fault regularly makes small earthquakes, to try to hit it there and be like, is this place special? Or like, is this an extra earthquake-prone body of rock right here that we could then find those other body of rocks, and then we'd know how big the earthquake patch would likely be. What they ended up finding down there was that instead of like one earthquake patch, they had many, many faults, and parts of it were slipping and parts of it were locked. And there was evidence for past earthquakes in areas that ought to have been slipping. They tried to put some geophysical instrumentation down there, but then the fault slipped and cut off the hole. So it looks like maybe other people in the room might have other opinions, but from where I stand, I don't think we're ever going to say there's going to be a magnitude 6 earthquake on this day in this suburb. Everyone get out, and we'll come back later and assess the damage kind of thing. Earthquake early warning and forecasting are the way forward. So forecasting says this area is more highly prone to earthquakes. That means it has a higher probability of ground shaking, and we're going to build for that ground shaking. And it's up to the governments to decide. Obviously building more robust structures and having a higher level of maintenance costs money, and destruction costs money. So some poor person, some poor actuary there has to decide how safe we want to be. And luckily that's not our job. But this is something we can do immediately that doesn't require a totally overhaul of our infrastructure. It's already been rolled out in a few places on the West Coast, and it is coming to Montreal someday soon. So the idea between earthquake early warning is that somewhere there's a fault source, and if you know where that is, you put lots of seismometers around that source that'll pick up the earthquake as soon as it happens. So they'll pick up the first waves that come from the earthquake. They'll send those to a computer that runs a model and very quickly decides if it's going to be a big earthquake or not. So the computer is going to decide that before the earthquake grows into a big earthquake. It's got to decide that very early. Once it makes a decision on that, though, the travel of the electrons through the communication wires is much faster than the travel of the seismic waves through the earth. So it makes a phone call to your cell phone and says, shaking expected in 32 seconds. Severe shaking in 15 seconds. So if you run a nuclear power plant or a dam or a hospital and you can activate emergency power and get backup power and lock down your systems, you have 30 seconds to do that. That's the difference between losing your infrastructure completely or turning it off, putting it on hold, and then turning it back on after the quake. So if we had that kind of warning, there's a lot of places that could have been saved. So the sensors go to the computers, and so this is actually the technology that's making this happen, is developing the ability to make those predictions based on less and less information so that you can, and it only protects cities that are farther from the fault. So this is a great kind of scenario for a place like Vancouver, which is onshore, and their fault is offshore. And so you have a really great potential for instrumenting that fault, getting the first motions, and then sending a message of warning into Vancouver. It won't help if your bridge is not good. If your bridge is not good, it's still going to get shaken down. But there are lots of things you can do with a little bit of warning. Okay. So shifting gears to Montreal, I found this. This is actually a testimony that appeared in the Pennsylvania Gazette in 1732 about the last great earthquake that struck our city. And so it goes through how one person wrote a letter to explain that this has really happened, and then another person had to travel from Montreal to New York to tell about it. But the estimation of magnitude 6 comes from a whole bunch of eyewitness accounts and secondary accounts like this, talking about violent shaking. 165 houses suffered more or less damage, and the walls fortifying the place in part were thrown down. 3 persons were killed. That was not verified. I think now they're saying that maybe nobody was killed because this is the only report of any deaths. That there were aftershocks, must have been scary size aftershocks for 9 or 10 days following. Only at night, that would be a coincidence, but people were afraid to stay in their houses. So this is something we see often in earthquake prone areas. So nobody knows exactly where this earthquake occurred. We don't have any faults that have broken the surface here that we could pin it on. Based on the distribution of eyewitness accounts, people think that it was epicentered in Montreal or very close to the island. So the modelers will go forward and talk about shaking from a 1732 type earthquake, and they just assign it a point source somewhere under Mount Royal. And they say, okay, what would happen if we had a magnitude 6 earthquake 10 kilometers deep under Mount Royal? So the other piece of information that goes into this is the mapping of the local soil classes. And so this map, it looks like very pixelated, but every one of those pixels is actually a measurement that was made by a group from our civil engineering department here at McGill. They go out and they put an instrument on the ground, and then they leave it there for, it's only a few minutes, but there's a hum of all the noise and all the sound that's going through the ground all the time. And so by listening to that with their instrument, they're able to say, okay, the upper 30 meters here are very stiff or very soft. They map the type of ground response that they see with their instrument. And so that's a very good predictor of how the ground response will be for an earthquake. So you'll be happy to see that A and B are the strong soil classes. So that means that they don't amplify waves. And most of the island is A and B because we have bedrock very close to the surface under most of the island. Where we don't have bedrock close to the surface, though, we have high liquefaction potential because some of these, we tend to have a very high water table here all times of year. And that does include some of the downtown and more densely populated suburb areas. And then these red areas are areas that have high liquefaction potential all the time. So these are loose sediments. They're completely built on And so that affects like suburbs in every direction around the city. Okay, I don't want to be too scary about it, but these are the common types of construction that are used in the greater Montreal area. So wood frame, and this includes wood with bricks tied to the outside of it, which is a lot of the residential areas near the city center. Steel, this is multi-story buildings with a steel frame, like an apartment building. Concrete buildings, masonry, which is all of our old stuff downtown, anything that's stone built, and then mobile houses. And so of the damage that each of these would experience during an earthquake, like a wood frame house, most of the houses would have no damage, and almost none of them would be completely destroyed during magnitude 6. But the masonry buildings have like a really high proportion of complete destruction, and then anything in this top half here is like probably uninhabitable. So,
did you get consulted when they put those new skyscrapers up near Atwater and St. Catherine? You just did it?
I'm not in the building business. I would be the right one to call, but
Nobody would have consulted.
they would have had to get a sign off from an engineer. But so like prior to 1970, there was no seismic component to the building code. And between 1970, which was the San Leandro earthquake, when they ramped it up everywhere, to 1990, they had what we call weak building codes here, where they were like, don't make it so it'll fall down in a breeze, kind of thing. And then from 1990, the federal building code has gotten a lot stronger and has taken into account the hazard map. So it'll be much stronger for us here because we're in a high hazard zone than it would be elsewhere in the prairies or someplace.
Anecdotally, I'm not sure this is true. I've heard that the Place Ville Marie, the cross skyscraper, is the first building in Quebec to have any sort of seismic code as part of its design.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so it's fully possible that someone could have built a safe building without being required to by federal law. That never occurred to me that would happen. But that would be cool. Yeah, so it must have been under construction around 1970 when they were.
So you said that there is a federal law now that
Yes.
they have to meet.
Yeah, and so NRCan puts out a new seismic hazard model about every 5 years, and then it propagates through the building codes with these kind of damage projections. But you're never really required to retrofit old buildings. So a younger city is much safer. An older city is much less safe.
Yeah. Good
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so what can you do? There are things we cannot prepare for on an individual level. This has to be done at all levels of government and society in order to have actual resilience in place. But there are some things you can do from your individual level and a little bit bigger, your workplace, whatever. So this is the website of La Grande Secousse du Québec, which is part of an international network of the Great Shakeout. It's an earthquake drill. It happens every year, and this year it's going to be 19th of October at 10:19 a.m. Everybody all over the world who participates will pretend to experience an earthquake at that time in their local time zone. And for me, that means I'm going to duck under the desk. I'm going to check that I have water supplies and stuff wherever I am in case I have to shelter in place. I'm going to check my first aid kit beforehand and make sure that I'm ready to go if anything happened. But on a larger scale, it could mean having an evacuation plan. If you're involved with kids, you want to make sure that you can reconnect families for school kids if something happens during the school day. So the big, you can participate as an individual or organization, but the emergency services people roll out full-on tabletop simulations at this point, and they deal with emergency service coordination for different scenarios. They look at infrastructure scale things, water supply, power, other things that affect the broad potential for resilience.
Do they tell us about that?
Did they tell you about it?
That happens every year?
Yeah, we've had trouble getting media attention to
Yeah,
this.
I've never heard about
Yeah.
that ever.
I
except
think
for today.
the emergency services are running tabletop stuff all the time. I think this is the day where they do earthquake stuff, but I don't think it
Don't put
normally
it in
gets.
the Gazette or the Press or the Westmount Independent, the Suburban. Nothing is publicized.
I'm not surprised, but if
Who's supposed to do that?
well, our organizers, we actually have new organizers for this event, which is the Association of Emergency Services of Quebec, and so they've been better and they're doing more social media stuff. This is some social media that we produced here at McGill, so I'll play it for you quickly. Let's see if it's going to play. This is an idea of the emergency kit that you would want to have. Oops, I don't know how to play this when I can't see my mouse. Yeah. Nope. Okay. Well, I can send around the website for this. Our videos and theirs are available on YouTube. And to prepare for an earthquake here, you basically want to be prepared on 2 levels. The first is to know what to do when the shaking occurs. And so that is very local to your place. So when you go home, when you get back to your office or whatever, look around and decide what might fall on you. Because most people are killed in earthquakes by falling building parts. So a sturdy table that would protect you from a swinging projector falling off its mount, or windows often crash into the building, so you don't want to be right in front of the window. You would want to dive away from the window and find something to get underneath. So the first thing is to stop, cover, and hold until the shaking stops. But then the next thing, and what's more critical, especially in our climate, is to be prepared to shelter in place. Because if we lost power to the city, or if we lost water supplies to the city, it would be a long time before everyone was safely equipped. And if that happened during the winter, it could be pretty critical in terms of people's safety. So what Ove is showing in this video is the contents of a go bag that has things like water purification tablets. If you have a stocked pantry at home, you probably have a lot of non-perishable food, but you could expect to be without refrigeration for a couple of weeks. Tools and emergency food, candles. She's got a radio because if your Wi-Fi goes down, you might not be able to get information about where to go and if they're opening up shelters and safety depots. Ways to keep warm, ways to make fire. So,
where do you get water purification tablets?
You probably get them at Canadian Tire. You can get them anywhere that emergency supplies is sold. Pumps are good, but tablets are also good. Yeah. And I'll send around the video if you want. Ove goes through the whole sack. This is like what's suggested by the emergency services of Quebec. Okay. So, in conclusion, earthquakes happen in Quebec. They're not as big as the tectonic plate boundaries, but they're going to be dangerous due to our antiquated infrastructure. And if every individual has short-term and medium-term plans for earthquake safety, one of the other tragedies that comes with any natural disaster is that there is emergency services available, but because most people haven't taken simple precautions, the demand is too great for the available services. So by taking care of yourself, you also free up emergency services to help somebody else who isn't as fortunate. So that's it. Any questions?
I would like to share something, since personal experience, concerning prediction and forecast. This is quite disputable. I mean, even by scientists. I'm not a scientist myself, but I'm an economist. I happened to be with my family in Los Angeles in 1994.
Oh, you were? Did you experience the earthquake?
We went to visit the relatives of my wife, and I mean, we personally had to speak with one of the relatives there. He had a shop in the downtown area of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
But I think it was something like maybe 15, 20, or 30 kilometers away, the center of the earthquake. And he said, it was really, everything was shaking.
Right.
The casualties, I think, not more than 100 at that time.
Yeah.
But the economic loss was huge.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, I asked the question, I mean, like, was this predictable? I said yes. Newspapers, some of the local newspapers said that it's going to come, like just a few months before it happens.
So here's the thing. If you look in it used to be newspapers, now it's the internet, you are going to find people blanketing time and space with predictions. And when the earthquake happens, you go back, you could find someone predicted it for that day. But like every day, someone predicted it for.
Right.
So it's not a useful prediction.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Say a useful prediction is precise and is reproducible. So whatever mechanism you use to make the prediction, it should work more than once. So lots of other things have been tried. Animal behavior is a big one. Water pressure changes in the ground, changes in springs. Earthquake weather was a thing for a while. Like it's not humid in California, so if it gets humid, it's earthquake weather. So none of these have statistically held up as being correlated to actual events. Okay.
thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you for coming to my talk.
Well, that was fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. One more round of applause. And we have a little gift just to say thank you.
Oh, stop, really?
No, we insist, absolutely. There's a little card
Thank you.
in my terrible handwriting. I hope you can read it. The library has a lovely sub-collection called the Blacker Wood Collection, which is pictures of plants. It's absolutely gorgeous, and we've created a colouring book of all the plants and insects and so on, which we thought you might enjoy.
I love it.
When you're not stressing about earthquakes, you can relax and colour in some pictures.
Thank you.
So thank you very much indeed.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Martin.
And I learned an enormous amount. That was